I always believed my father was the kind of man other people looked up to. When I was a little girl, I used to watch him walk into a room and somehow command everyone's attention without saying a word. He had this presence about him, a quiet authority that made you feel safe, like everything would be alright as long as he was around. He wasn't the kind of dad who played catch in the yard or told silly jokes at the dinner table, but he provided. He worked hard, and he always made sure my mum, my brother and I had what we needed. That was enough for me when I was young. I remember Sunday mornings when he'd leave early, dressed in his best suit, saying he had business meetings, even though it was the weekend. Mum never questioned it out loud, but I would catch her eyes following him out the door, her lips pressed into a thin line. Back then I thought she was just upset that he worked too much, that maybe she wanted him to spend more time with us. I never imagined those polished shoes and crisp shirts meant anything darker. Growing up, I adored him in that blind way kids often do. He was larger than life to me, even though he was emotionally distant. When he came home late at night and I heard his key turning in the lock, I'd run from my room just to hug him. He'd pat me on the head absent-mindedly, always smelling faintly of cologne and cigarette smoke. Sometimes, I'd notice he had a different tie on than the one he left the house with, but I never thought twice about it. Why would I? He was my dad. My trust in him was unshakable. As I got older, small cracks began to show, though I didn't understand them at the time. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, school plays. He'd buy expensive gifts as if that would make up for his absence. Once, when I was 12, he bought me a necklace with a delicate silver heart. I loved it, but when I showed it to my mum, she froze for a moment before forcing a smile. Only years later did I realize she recognized it, not because she had seen it before, but because she knew the style wasn't something he picked out himself. She knew, even back then, that there was another woman. But I didn't. My first real clue came when I was 15. One night, I went to grab something from his car because I'd left my backpack in the back seat. When I opened the glove compartment looking for a flashlight, an envelope slipped out. Inside were photos of him. Photos of him with another woman, holding her hand, laughing in a way I had never seen him laugh with us. My chest tightened, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of me. I shoved the pictures back into the envelope so quickly that I cut my finger on the edge of the paper. My heart pounded so loud I was sure someone could hear it. I didn't know what to do. Do I tell my mom? Do I confront him? Do I pretend I never saw them? That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my finger throbbing from the paper cut, my stomach churning with confusion. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the hallway wall, the occasional creak of the pipes. I thought about my mum sleeping just down the hall, about how she trusted him enough to share her life with him, and I wanted to scream. But I was 15, and he was my dad. I couldn't bring myself to shatter her world. Instead, I shoved it all down, convincing myself that maybe it wasn't what it looked like, that maybe I had misunderstood. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it would only grow from there. The weeks after finding those photos felt like walking around with a secret that was too heavy for me to carry. Every time my dad spoke to me or asked how school was going, I could barely look at him, because in my head I kept replaying those images of him smiling at another woman, leaning close to her in a way that he never leaned toward my mom. And I wanted to shout, but instead I just nodded and pretended everything was fine, even though I felt like my chest was caving in. I would sit at the dinner table and study his face while he talked about work, his words flowing easily as if nothing was wrong, and sometimes I wondered if I imagined it all. But then I'd remember the sting of that paper cut and how my hand shook as I stuffed the envelope back, and I knew it was real. I knew my father wasn't who I thought he was. My mum seemed to sense my shift in mood. She would ask if something was bothering me, And I'd tell her it was just school, exams, friends, anything but the truth, because how could I tell her something that would break her heart? How could I destroy the family we had by saying words I couldn't take back? At night I started listening more carefully to their conversations, the muffled voices behind their bedroom door, the silences that stretched too long, the way my mum's laugh sounded forced when he made some offhand comment, and I realized that maybe she already knew, maybe she had known for years and was just pretending to, holding the pieces together because she thought it was better than letting everything fall apart. The tension in the house grew so thick I felt it pressing against my skin. In the mornings he would kiss my mum on the cheek before leaving for work, and I noticed she never turned her face fully toward him anymore, her hands busy with the coffee pot, her smile tight and brittle, and I wondered if that was what marriage became, a performance played for the sake of children and neighbors and family friends, all of us pretending not to see the cracks forming in the walls around us. One afternoon I came home earlier than usual from school and the house was strangely quiet, sunlight spilling through the blinds in thin stripes across the living room carpet, and on the kitchen counter I saw an open letter, just sitting there, his handwriting unmistakable, and even though I knew I shouldn't read it I couldn't stop myself. My eyes traced over the words and they were not meant for my mum, they were meant for her, for the woman in the pictures, words of affection and promises of weekends away, of building a life together someday, and my stomach twisted so violently I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from falling. I shoved the letter back where I found it, but I knew nothing could erase it from my memory, nothing could unwrite the fact that my father was living two lives, one with us and one with her, and I felt like I was caught between them, stuck in a lie that wasn't even mine, a lie I never asked to keep but was forced to carry. After that day with the letter I started noticing even more little details that I had probably ignored before. The way my father's phone would always be face down on the table, the quick movements when he slid it into his pocket if someone walked into the room, the late night calls he would take outside on the porch when he thought everyone was asleep, and I would lie in bed straining my ears trying to catch bits of his hushed voice through the glass, my heart thudding like I was the one sneaking around when really it was him, and the guilt of knowing something I could never say out loud began to eat at me. My mum's eyes looked heavier, like shadows had permanently settled underneath them, and she seemed to be moving through her days on autopilot, cooking dinner, folding laundry, paying bills, but her smile rarely reached her eyes anymore, and I kept wondering if she had seen the letter too. If she had been carrying this burden long before I stumbled into it, and if so, why didn't she leave? Why didn't she scream? Why did she let him walk in every night with that same calm face as though our family wasn't built on secrets? I remember one Saturday morning when he said he had errands to run. He grabbed his jacket and car keys, and something in me snapped. I followed him, my hands sweaty on the steering wheel as I drove a few cars behind, terrified he would see me, terrified I'd be caught, and yet desperate for confirmation that I wasn't imagining it all, that the world I believed in hadn't just been a bad dream. He drove across town to a quiet street, lined with tall trees, parked outside a small brick house with white shutters, and when the door opened she came out, the same woman from the photos, smiling like she had been waiting all morning just for him, and he leaned in to kiss her with a tenderness I had never seen directed at my mum, and in that moment my whole body went cold, like someone had poured ice water through my veins. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, tears blurring my vision, and I wanted to slam the horn, to scream, to make him see me sitting there, but instead I drove away shaking, pulling over 2 blocks later because I couldn't breathe, gasping into my hands while people walked by without noticing that a teenage girl's world had just been ripped in two. From that day forward, every time he came home, I saw him differently. His smile looked like a mask, his hugs felt shallow, and when he asked me about my day, I wanted to spit the truth in his face, to ask him whose day he cared more about, mine or hers. But I stayed silent because I didn't know how to choose between loyalty to my mum and the love I once had for him. The house felt smaller, the air thicker, like the walls were closing in on me, and I began to withdraw, spending more time in my room with the door shut, music blasting in my headphones so I wouldn't have to hear his footsteps in the hall, footsteps that once meant safety and now only reminded me of betrayal. The hardest part was pretending I didn't know, pretending that everything was normal when inside I felt like I was living in a stranger's house. Every time my father poured himself a cup of coffee or flipped through the newspaper at the kitchen table, I wanted to shout and tell him that I had seen it all, that I had followed him, that his secret wasn't safe anymore. But instead I kept my mouth shut and the silence burned inside me like fire that had nowhere to go, and it made me bitter, it made me angry in ways I didn't even recognize in myself. My mom carried on as if nothing had changed, though sometimes when she thought no one was looking, I caught her standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her face tilted slightly toward the glass as though she was staring at something far away, and I wondered if she was imagining a life without him, or if she was simply too tired to imagine anything at all. One evening I came into the living room, and found her holding a photograph of their wedding, her fingers tracing the edge of his face, her lips pressed together so tightly that I thought they might split. And when she noticed me standing there, she quickly put the photo back on the shelf, forcing a smile that didn't match her eyes, telling me she was just cleaning, but I knew better. I could feel the weight of her sadness even when she tried to hide it. My brother seemed oblivious, still laughing with Dad when he took him to baseball practice, still bragging about how Dad promised to help him with his science project, and I hated him for not seeing what I saw. I hated that I had to carry the knowledge alone, like I had been chosen to be the guardian of a secret that was slowly destroying me from the inside. I began to pull away from my friends too, because how could I explain to them why I suddenly felt older than all of them, why jokes about crushes and school dances seemed trivial when my entire family was sitting on a fault line that could split open at any second. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house, and I would imagine the two lives my father lived, one under our roof and one under hers, and the thought made me nauseous. It made me feel like everything I had believed about love and marriage and family was just a beautifully wrapped lie, a story we told ourselves because the truth was too unbearable. I started writing in a journal, pouring out every thought, every fear, every ounce of anger, the pages filling with my cramped handwriting until my fingers ached, and sometimes I ripped the paper because the pen pressed too hard, and I'd stare at the torn edges thinking how they looked like the edges of my life, jagged and fragile and impossible to piece back together. There was one night that still lingers in my memory like it happened yesterday, a night when the truth almost spilled out of me. We were sitting at the dinner table, the four of us, my father talking about some project at work while my brother shoveled mashed potatoes into his mouth and my mum quietly refilled glasses of water, and suddenly I felt this wave of anger so strong I had to grip my fork to stop my hands from shaking. I looked at him and all I could see was the image of him leaning in to kiss her outside that brick house, and my chest burned with the weight of it, so I blurted out, "Where do you really go when you say you have meetings?" My voice trembling but louder than I intended, and the whole table froze. My brother's For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. And then he laughed. Not a real laugh, but the kind he used at parties when he wanted to smooth things over. And he said I had too much imagination, that I should focus on school instead of making up stories. And my mum quickly changed the subject, asking my brother about practice, her voice thin and shaky, and I realized she wasn't going to back me up. She wasn't ready to let the truth be spoken out loud. I pushed my food around my plate until I could excuse myself, retreating to my room where I pressed my face into a pillow and screamed silently, the kind of scream that rips through your body but makes no sound. And afterward I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe this was the way families broke, not in loud explosions but in quiet suffocation, in secrets that festered until no one could breathe. The next day he acted as if nothing had happened, as if my question had been a passing teenage outburst, and he even brought me a milkshake after work, setting it on the counter with a smile like everything was normal. but the gesture made me sick, because now every act of kindness felt like manipulation, like he was trying to buy my silence the same way he bought my mum expensive necklaces or weekend trips to spas whenever she looked too tired. I hated him for making me question my own reality, for making me feel like I was crazy when I knew I wasn't, and I hated myself for not standing up, for not screaming the truth in front of everyone, for slipping back into the silence that was slowly swallowing me whole. I began to realize that maybe the worst part of betrayal isn't the act itself but the pretending afterward. The way you keep living under the same roof, eating at the same table, saying goodnight with a kiss on the cheek, while inside you're screaming and no one can hear you. As the months dragged on, I felt myself changing in ways I couldn't explain. I became quieter around my friends. I skipped parties. I stopped raising my hand in class because it seemed pointless to talk when the words inside me were too heavy to share. And every time I looked at my father, I saw not the man who used to tuck me into bed with a pat on the head, but a stranger who had built his life on lies. And yet he still smiled like he was proud of me, still told relatives how well I was doing in school, and the contradiction of it made me sick. It made me wonder if maybe his whole life was just performance, if maybe we were all just his audience clapping politely while he played the role of devoted husband. I started spending more time at the library after school, not because I loved studying but because I couldn't stand going home to that house where the air was heavy with things unsaid. I'd sit between the shelves, breathing in the smell of old books, tracing the spines with my fingers, and sometimes I'd imagine running away, disappearing into another city where no one knew me, where no one could tie me to his mistakes. One rainy afternoon, while I sat in the corner of the library, I saw him through the window, standing under an umbrella with her, laughing like he was a young man again, carefree and in love. And the sight punched me in the gut so hard I nearly doubled over. Because here he was in my world, my sanctuary, staining it with his double life, and I had to turn away before I burst into tears in front of strangers. That night when he came home, drenched from the rain, shaking off his umbrella at the door, I stared at him so hard my eyes hurt, wondering if he could feel the hatred radiating from me, but he just smiled and said dinner smelled good, as if he hadn't just stood across town with another woman while his real family waited here. My mum must have noticed my mood because later she came to my room, sat on the edge of my bed and asked if everything was okay, her hand smoothing my blanket, her voice soft, and I almost told her then. I almost blurted out everything, but when I saw her tired eyes I swallowed the words, afraid that hearing them would crush whatever fragile strength she had left, so I just nodded and said I was fine, and she kissed my forehead like she used to when I was a child. Though I felt guilty because I knew I was protecting her with silence that was slowly killing me. The truth is, silence can be louder than screaming. It rings in your ears, it echoes in your chest, it follows you down hallways and sits beside you at meals, and that silence had become my constant companion, pressing against me until I thought I might explode, but I didn't. I just carried it, because I didn't know what else to do. And because some part of me still wished that maybe he would choose us, that maybe one morning he would wake up and remember that he had a family who loved him, and that would be enough to make him stop. The longer I carried his secret, the heavier it became, like a weight strapped to my chest that no one else could see, and I began to notice how it seeped into every corner of my life, how it changed the way I looked at boys in school who flirted with me in the hallways. Because instead of feeling flattered, I felt suspicious, waiting for the moment they would turn into liars too. And I hated that my father's choices had stolen the simplicity of trust from me, before I even had the chance to experience it for myself. I remember one night lying in bed listening to the sound of their voices in the kitchen, muffled but sharp, the kind of tones people use when they're trying not to wake the kids, and I crept to the hallway and pressed my ear against the cool wall, straining to hear my mum's voice, low and shaky, as she asked him where he had been, why he kept working so late, and his reply was smooth, too smooth, like a rehearsed line in a play, and when she didn't answer right away, I could almost feel the silence choking her, like she wanted to believe him but couldn't quite force herself to swallow the lie. I went back to my room and curled up under my blanket, tears soaking into the pillow because I realized then that she did know. Maybe not every detail but enough. And yet she stayed. She let him crawl into bed beside her night after night. And I couldn't understand how love could make someone cling to a man who was breaking her piece by piece. The anger inside me grew sharper, and I started writing not just in my journal but on scraps of paper that I would shove into shoeboxes under my bed, letters addressed to him that I never sent, filled with words I was too scared to speak. Sentences like, "I hate you for making me lie by staying silent," and "You don't deserve her love or mine." And sometimes I would rip the pages into tiny pieces just to feel the release of destruction, watching the shreds scatter across the floor like confetti at a funeral. At school I put on a smile, laughing at jokes, pretending everything was fine, but I could feel the distance growing between me and my friends, because none of them knew why I was different, why I was guarded, why I sometimes stared out the window for whole class periods as if I was somewhere else. And the truth is I was trapped in that other life my father was living, imagining what he said to her, what he promised her, if he whispered the same words to her that he once whispered to my mum, and the thought of it made me sick, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. One evening after dinner he fell asleep in the armchair, with the television still flickering in front of him, and I sat across the room staring at his face, at the lines etched around his mouth, the grey beginning to streak his hair, and I wondered how many lies a person could carry before they became part of his skin, before they changed the very shape of his smile, and I realized that maybe the man I thought I knew had been gone for a long time, replaced by this stranger who lived two lives and expected me to never notice. It was during my last year of high school that the weight of everything finally began to crack me open, because the closer I got to leaving home, the more desperate I became to understand what kind of life I had really been living in. Was it a family or was it a lie we had all been rehearsing for years? And I remember standing in the bathroom one morning staring at my reflection, my eyes swollen from crying the night before, and realizing that I no longer recognized the girl looking back at me. She seemed older, harder, like someone who had already seen too much of the world, and it terrified me to think that my father had taken away my chance to be innocent just a little. That spring I skipped class one afternoon and took the bus across town, my heart hammering the whole way, because I had made up my mind that I needed to see her up close, the woman who had stolen my father's attention, the woman who had been living in the shadows of my life. And when I got off on her street and walked past that same brick house with the white shutters, my palms sweating, I saw her stepping out to water the flowers, humming softly to herself, her hair pulled back, looking so ordinary it almost made me laugh through my tears, 'cause in my head she had always been some glamorous villain, but here she was just a woman in jeans and a t-shirt, tending to her garden as if she hadn't been the sun. I stood across the street frozen, wanting to scream at her, to ask if she ever thought about me, about my mum, about the nights I lay awake because of her, but the words died in my throat and I turned away, running back toward the bus stop with tears streaking down my face, my chest aching from holding so much inside. That night at dinner I could barely eat. Every time I looked at him I saw her face too, the ordinary woman with the watering can, and it made me furious that something so simple could destroy something so sacred, that love could be stolen not with diamonds or grand gestures, but with quiet mornings and secret smiles. My mum noticed my silence, asking gently if something was wrong, but I shook my head and told her I was just tired, though inside I wanted to grab her hands and beg her to open her eyes, to stop pretending, to stop letting him live two lives while we all paid the price. Instead, I excused myself early and went to my room, pulling out my journal and writing until the words blurred on the page, sentences spilling over each other, long and frantic, like maybe if I filled enough notebooks I could make sense of the chaos in my heart. Sometimes I would imagine confronting him on graduation day, standing there in my cap and gown with my diploma in hand and telling him I knew everything, telling him he had ruined my childhood, but other times I would imagine packing my bags and disappearing into college life without a word, leaving him to wonder why his daughter no longer called, why she no longer came home, and the thought gave me a small sense of power, a taste of control in a life where I had been given none. Graduation came and went like a blur of flashing cameras and clapping hands, my classmates tossing their caps into the air while parents cheered from the bleachers, and I remember scanning the crowd, finding my father's face as he waved proudly, his smile wide and convincing, and for a split second I almost believed it. Almost let myself pretend he was just a normal dad who had shown up to support his daughter. But then the memory of that other life, that other house, that other woman, crept back in and soured everything, and I felt like I was living two realities at once, one where I was supposed to celebrate and one where I was quietly drowning in betrayal. After the ceremony we took photos, my mum standing stiffly beside him, her smile tight and fragile like porcelain that could crack with the slightest pressure, and my brother laughing, his arms slung over my shoulder as though nothing in our family had ever been wrong, and I wanted to shake him, to scream that we were all pretending, that the man holding the camera and calling us his pride and joy was also the man who kissed someone else goodnight. But instead I forced a smile and let the flash blind me, adding another photograph to the gallery of lies. That summer before college was the hardest, because the walls of our house felt even thinner, the silences sharper, and I found myself avoiding him as much as possible, slipping out to spend hours at coffee shops or wandering the park just so I wouldn't have to sit across from him at the dinner table. And when he tried to ask about my plans for school, I gave him short answers, watching confusion flicker across his face as though he truly didn't understand why I had grown so distant. One night he knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk, his voice low and strangely gentle, and I froze, notebook still open in my lap, pen halfway across the page, because part of me thought maybe he was about to confess, maybe he was finally going to tell the truth, but when I let him in he only sat on the edge of my desk chair and told me how proud he was, how much he loved me, and the words felt like poison sliding into my ears, because I couldn't trust them, I couldn't believe that someone who loved me could also lie to me so completely. I nodded, biting my lips so hard I tasted blood, and when he left the room I collapsed against the door, my whole body trembling from holding back everything I wanted to scream. The night before I moved into the dorms my mum helped me pack, folding clothes into neat stacks, her hands brushing mine every so often, and I saw something in her eyes, a kind of unspoken plea, as if she wanted me to be free of all of this, as if she was silently begging me not to repeat her mistakes. And I hugged her so tightly that she laughed nervously, telling me she wasn't dying, just letting me go to college, but I knew she understood, I knew she felt the same fractures I did, even if she never said the words out loud. When we loaded the car the next morning, my father carried the boxes with ease, cracking jokes about how heavy my books must be, and all I could think was that he looked like any other dad helping his daughter move into a new chapter of her life. And I hated how ordinary it seemed, because nothing about it was ordinary. Everything was tainted, and I wondered if the people walking past us on the campus sidewalks could see it in my face, if they could tell that the man smiling beside me wasn't who he pretended to be. College was supposed to feel like freedom, and in many ways it did, the campus buzzing with life, the smell of fresh coffee in the student union, the sound of laughter spilling out of dorm rooms late at night, and I tried to lose myself in it, to believe I was just another 18-year-old discovering who she was, but the truth followed me like a shadow. The knowledge of my father's double life clinging to me no matter how many new friends I made or how many classes I aced, and sometimes I would be sitting in the library surrounded by strangers and suddenly feel like I couldn't breathe, like I was back in that kitchen holding his letter in my hands, the words blurring because I didn't tell anyone at first, not my roommates, not the boy who sat beside me in philosophy class and made me laugh, because how do you begin to explain that the man who raised you, the man who told you to always be honest, built his life on lies, and that you were forced to carry that truth like a secret disease, invisible, but corrosive? I called home every Sunday, and my mum's voice was always calm, asking about classes and roommates, but I could hear the fatigue beneath it, the kind that doesn't come from work but from years of disappointment, and sometimes my father would take the phone, his voice booming with pride, telling me he missed me, and I would answer politely while staring at the dorm ceiling, feeling numb, wondering if he ever said those same words to her when she was away. Thanksgiving was the first time I came home. and walking through the front door felt strange, like stepping into a stage set where everything was arranged just so. The smells of turkey and cinnamon candles filling the air, my brother talking excitedly about school, my mum bustling in the kitchen, and then my father hugging me tight, his cologne the same as always, and I froze because the scent instantly transported me back to that night. I saw him outside her house, and I had to pull away quickly before he noticed the tears stinging my eyes. Dinner was filled with laughter, stories, the clinking of silverware, but I couldn't stop watching my parents' faces, the way my mum's smile never quite reached her eyes, the way my father leaned back in his chair looking satisfied, and I wanted to stand up and slam my hands on the table, to force the truth into the open, but I didn't. I just sat there eating cranberry sauce that tasted like ash in my mouth. Later that night I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to my ceiling from when I was 10, and I realized how much had been stolen from me, not just trust in him but trust in the world, in the idea that families could be safe places, and I promised myself that I would never live like my mum, swallowing lies for the sake of appearances. I would never let someone break me quietly. I would rather walk away bleeding than stay and suffocate. As the years went on and I built a life of my own far from that house, the weight of what I carried didn't disappear, it only settled deeper inside me, shaping the way I saw people, shaping the way I measured love. Because even when I met someone kind and steady who looked at me with eyes full of sincerity, I kept waiting for the crack, for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. And I hated that my father had planted that doubt in me like a seed that kept growing no matter how much I wanted to cut it out. I visited home less and less, always finding excuses, long hours at work, tight schedules, and when I did go back I noticed how time had carved its mark on all of us. My brother taller, my mum thinner, her laugh still soft but her shoulders slumped as though she had carried too much for too long, and my father older, his hair more grey but still with that same smooth smile as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong, and it made me sick because I knew the truth he had hidden, and yet he lived as if it had no consequence. One Christmas I arrived unannounced a day earlier than planned and walked into the living room to find him on the phone, his voice low and gentle in a way I had never heard him speak to my mother, and I didn't need to guess who was on the other end. I simply stood there frozen until he noticed me, his face draining of color as if the years of lies had finally caught up, but instead of confessing he hung up quickly and asked if my drive had been safe, as though nothing had happened, and that moment broke something final in me, because I realized he would never admit it, never take responsibility, he would carry his secrets to the grave if it meant protecting his That night I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, my breath rising in the cold air, and I thought about my mother sleeping in the next room. About all the time she must have known but chose silence, and for the first time I felt a different kind of anger, not just at him but at her too, for letting his betrayal become the air we breathed, for teaching me that love meant endurance instead of honesty, and I vowed to myself that I would break that cycle, that I would never let my own children grow up under the weight of unspoken truths. It was in that promise that I found a small sliver of peace. A sense that maybe the pain I carried could at least become a boundary, a guidepost, something that would stop the poison from spilling into another generation, and I held on to that thought as tightly as I once held on to my silence, because it was the only way to make sense of the years I had lost. The last time I truly confronted him wasn't with screaming or accusations the way I had once imagined late at night when the anger burned hottest. It was quieter, sharper, almost cruel in its calmness, because I had reached a point where I no longer needed him to admit what I already knew. I only needed to release myself from the prison of silence he had built around me. So one evening when he tried to ask about my work and my future in that same cheerful tone he always used, I looked him directly in the eyes and told him I hoped one day he would understand what it meant to be honest. That I hoped he would realize how much of his family he had lost by living two lives, and for the first time in years he had no reply, just sat there with his mouth slightly open, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second, and in that moment I felt a strange rush of power, like I had taken back a piece of myself that he had stolen. After that night I stopped visiting so often, and eventually the calls grew less frequent too, not because I wanted revenge in the petty sense but because I understood that cutting distance was the only way to protect myself. And when my mother later admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability that she had always known, that she had chosen to stay for reasons I may never fully understand, I hugged her and forgave her in my heart, though I also promised myself never to repeat her choices, never to confuse endurance with love. Years later, when I stood in my own kitchen holding my newborn daughter, the weight of it all came back in a rush, the late nights, the lies, the suffocating silence, and I whispered to her that she would never grow up in the shadows of secrets, that I would rather break every piece of my life than let her carry the kind of burden I had carried, and I felt tears stream down my face not from sadness, but from a kind of fierce determination. My father grew older, frailer, and even as he aged he never confessed, never dropped the mask, but by then I no longer needed him to, because I had already written my own ending. One where his double life didn't define me but instead became the reason I chose to live differently, the reason I built my world on truth no matter how painful it sometimes was. And though part of me will always carry the scar of what he did, I also know that scars can remind us not just of pain but of survival. And when I look back on the girl I was, staring at the ceiling of her childhood room with tears in her eyes, I want to tell her that one day she will be free, one day she will stop suffocating, and that the silence that once nearly destroyed her will become her loudest vow to herself and to those she loves.